we're starting to see very significant economic implications. So this isn't a theoretical problem in 2050. This is a real world economic problem today. So we need to take a very hard-headed look and saying, okay, like here's the economic cost of what's happening today. Can we start to reduce those costs by getting greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere down? And what is the lowest cost, most implementable solutions to that?
Carbonsations, today's carbon industry leaders.
Are you passionate about climate action and staying on top of the latest trends in the world of carbon capture, removal, and markets? Then the Carbon Herald has you covered. Every week, we bring you the top news, breakthroughs, and insights from the world of carbon management, delivered straight to your inbox. No fluff, no jargon, just the essential info you need to stay informed. So whether you're a climate professional or just someone who cares, make sure you're subscribed. Visit carbonherald.com and sign up today for our weekly newsletter. Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Joining us for this week's episode is Barclay Rogers, CEO and founder of carbon removal company Graphyte. Barclay, thank you so much for being here today. It's a pleasure to meet you, and I can't wait to learn more about what Graphyte does. However, before we do, it's tradition on this show that we first get to know more about our guest's background first. So without further ado, please do share with us a little of what you used to do before entering the carbon removal industry.
Sure. And Vada, thank you very much for welcoming to your podcast. I'm excited to be here. My overall background, I think I can distill it down into just a handful of categories. One is I grew up with a farming background, worked on a farm when I was in university, and so have real kind of hands-on experience at the farm level. I decided to become a lawyer, and so I practiced law really like an environmental litigator for about 10 years. And then I realized that, that's not how I wanted to make my living. I wanted to try to, instead of just fighting about things, I wanted to try to solve problems. And from there, I basically became an entrepreneur. And so I've worked in a series of startups, almost all of them focused in the natural resources space in one way or another, have done a number of different things in the carbon removal space. I'm sure we could talk some more about that, as well as in the agricultural technology space. So I think you can kind of distill my background down to, three core areas. Is one, very significant experience at the farm level, two, in the courtroom, and three, at the entrepreneurial coalface.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So, Barclay, moving on to Graphyte, what inspired you to look into carbon removal, and why choose to found your own company as opposed to joining an existing one today?
Yeah, so there's a number of different things to say here. Let's start with just carbon removal generally. And I have something of an idiosyncratic view here, and that is that, my overall thought process is, we need to focus on, the causes of climate change, right? Excess greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and really take a very practical, that is a kind of techno-economic view of the feasibility of activities that will lower greenhouse gas or CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And so, when I look across the entirety of the spectrum, that's really how I view carbon removal. Is it more feasible to do than some abatement activity? That's not in any way to say I'm I'm more favorable of removal to abatement. I'm just, neutral, if you will, in terms of is it removal or abatement, and just have a real sort of techno-economic lens on that. Okay, so that's the starting point. And then when I start to look across various carbon removal technologies, my thinking here is relatively straightforward. And that is that, on the one hand, it's very hard to, if you're focused on carbon removal, you're focused on the first step is separating carbon dioxide from other atmospheric gases. And so it's a, less than 0.4 or roughly 0.4% concentration in the atmosphere. So no matter how you do it, it's going to require a lot of energy to separate that CO2 from atmospheric air. And so that's what plants naturally do. And they're powered by the sun, right? That is the photosynthesis process. And so I have a strong perspective that biomass plays a very meaningful role in carbon capture for that reason alone, that it's plants doing the hardest work of the overall process and they're powered naturally by the sun. Now, then the challenge with biomass, of course, is that it's very hard to measure the amount of carbon that's been removed. I saw one of your podcasts about the assumptions that are inherent in many carbon removal, estimations, if you will, right? And so, and it's also got kind of permanence or longevity issues. You're not sure how much has been removed. You're not sure how long it's going to stay out of the atmosphere. And, that's what, at Graphyte, we really zeroed in. And it's like, okay, biomass is your most effective means of capturing carbon. How can you then take that captured carbon in biomass material and ensure that the removal is both a measurable removal and one that will be long lasting? And that's how we arrived at the carbon casting process.
Yes, and that is a very unique approach to CDR as far as I know. Like, I can't personally recall coming across it elsewhere. Can you describe more in detail perhaps what carbon casting is exactly?
Yeah. So carbon casting, again, let's start with the carbon in the biomass material, right? So again, how does a tree grow? A tree is growing, or any plant for that matter, is growing by photosynthesis. What is photosynthesis doing? It's taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, turning it into various carbon molecules, and that becomes plant matter. Okay, so most biomass material is on the order of 50% carbon, right? Now, before we talk about what we're doing with carbon casting, let's just kind of follow that carbon cycle. Let's follow the life cycle of that plant. So let's just assume for the moment that it's a tree, grows to its full life, it falls over in the forest and it starts to decompose, right? So anybody who spent any time understands that biomass decomposes in the natural cycle. This is the carbon cycle, okay? And so the origins of the carbon casting process are understanding the causes of biomass degradation, biomass decomposition, and those are microbes, okay? So what causes a tree to rot in the forest, your food waste to decompose? It's microbe, right? So microbes are effectively eating that biomass material and excreting the carbon either in the form of CO2 or methane. It depends on the decomposition pathway. So what are we doing at Graphyte is we're in our carbon casting processes, we're essentially halting biomass degradation, and we're doing so by taking away the things that the microbe needs to live, and that is water. Okay, so to summarize quickly, biomass has 50% carbon. That carbon is going to release back to the atmosphere through microbial degradation, decomposition. If we can take away the water, we can stop the microbial decomposition.
Okay, so you're essentially dehydrating biomass, correct?
Exactly. So we take the biomass material. Again, we're talking about the byproducts of agriculture and timber industries. Roughly 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent is generated in the byproducts of agricultural and timber globally. That's per year. So we take that material, we bring it to a centralized facility, something we call a processing facility. We grind it up, we dry it down, again, going below a moisture content at which microbial activity ceases. We densify it. We then encase that material in a waterproof barrier. Again, it's all about keeping the biomass dry in perpetuity. And then we place that encapsulated biomass material in a lined chamber, an underground chamber, what we would call a sequestration site.
Okay. Does it have to be like in any kind of specific geologic formation, or?
It does, but it's those geologic conditions are very widespread. So what you're looking to do, again, it's about keeping biomass material dry. And so the immediate biomass material is encased. Your primary protection from water intrusion is the encasing layer. Your redundant or secondary barrier of water intrusion is the liner in the sequestration site. Essentially, it's a lined, underground chamber. And so what you don't want to happen, if you will, is to have that chamber try to float away. That is, that the groundwater tries to lift the chamber up. So the geologic conditions that you're looking for are, well above the groundwater table, right? So you can dig a hole in the ground that doesn't automatically refill with water. and then relatively low permeability soils. But again, those conditions are quite widespread.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Really, really appreciate the explanation. It says on your website that carbon casting is also affordable and scalable. How so?
Yeah, so there's a few things there is, again, and let's go back and just, in the durable and kind of the origin, story. So we've got across the carbon removal landscape, right? We have nature-based solutions, which are biomass-based solutions, but they have quantification and permanence questions. And then you've got other forms of what is often called durable or engineered carbon dioxide removal. And durable really means that it's measurable and it has a permanence of, 1,000 years or more. And so we're in that durable category. And the thing I think to really think about there is how I described at the start of the discussion here is the most expensive part of carbon capture is the separation of CO2 from atmospheric air. Okay, in our case, that's also the most energy intensive part. It's really part and parcel of the same thing. That's why it's so costly, is because it's so energy intensive. And so that part of the process is taken care, in our case, by nature alone. Okay, again, it's plants naturally capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. So the reason that carbon casting is so much more affordable and so much, faces far fewer technical hurdles is simply because the most difficult part is being done by a process that nature has already perfected.
Understood. So moving on to perhaps like slightly bigger industry questions. In your experience working with carbon removal solutions, what would you say are the main challenges in this sector and what can be done to overcome them?
Yeah, so I think there's a few. Overall, the biggest challenge in this space is really on the demand function, right? And that is that we have a relatively, small number of large buyers. And thank goodness that those buyers are out there, okay? The leaders on CDR.FY, the Microsoft, Frontier, Google's, and so on, they are really performing a catalytic role in the market. But there's very few of them. Okay, so the major thing that this market needs is a larger and broader set of buyers, right? Because no market can survive, no technology can get to scale without demand. Okay. Now, on the other side of the equation, it really depends on a technology by technology approach of kind of what is the tech readiness of the technology. Right. And so in the case of graphite, certainly relative to most of the technologies out there is, we are high on the tech readiness, high on the scaling, potential. And the reason for that is we have relatively low technology risk. And it all comes back to, biomass being our form of carbon capture and then using a number of, well-established, well-understood industrial processes to ensure that biomass is just, preserved and kept dry in perpetuity. So we're essentially able to stand on the shoulders of many other industry innovations in order to implement our process at scale.
And with all of that said, Barclay, where do you see carbon removal in the United States and globally headed in the future?
We're going to have it. I mean, there's just kind of no other way of going about it. And again, I'll go back to the very start of our conversation. And that is, I think we need to take a very practical lens at this. I recently wrote something in the Carbon Herald looking at the economic cost of climate change, and it's serious, right? I mean, we're starting to see very significant economic implications. So this isn't a theoretical problem in 2050. This is a real world economic problem today. So we need to take a very hard-headed look and saying, okay, here's the economic cost of what's happening today. Can we start to reduce those costs by getting greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere down? And what is the lowest cost, most implementable solutions to that? So I think that's the most straightforward answer is we have to deal with it. We have certain technologies that are ready to go today. Let's get those out the door and let's continue to develop new technologies down the pike.
So do you believe we stand a chance at achieving net zero emissions by 2050 the way things are going now?
I think we have to try. One of the things that I pay a lot of attention to is, just the data, right? And the data I pay most attention to the United States because that's where I live. And, if we look at the emissions profile, aggregate emissions in the United States, over the last 30 years or so, they're flat, okay? There's a lot of talk, right? But there's not a whole lot of action. And so, I think we just have to get started, okay? I won't prognosticate on the feasibility of hitting net zero by 2050. I candidly don't know. But what I do know is that the economic consequences of climate change are very real, and we need to do everything we can to address those challenges, not from a feel-good, I want to do some good in the world, but from a practical habitability, economic cost consideration. Let's start to get our emissions down. Let's start to get greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere down from a sheer economic rationale.
On that note, something that just came to my mind is regarding scalability. Do you have an estimate in mind as to what Graphyte's carbon removal capacity is currently, or perhaps the capacity that you're aiming for in the future?
Yeah, so a few ways of kind of looking at that is, let's go to the aggregate biomass residuals per year is on the order of 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalents per year. So if you literally took every ton of biomass residual across the globe and performed the carbon casting process, the theoretical capacity of graphite is 3 billion tons of CO2 per year. Okay. Of course, we're a very long way away from that. And there's many other, entities and technologies that want to use biomass residuals. Okay. So let's start where we are today. And so I founded the company in February of 2023. Roughly 2 years later, or 1 year later, we had an operating facility sized at about 15,000 tons of carbon dioxide removal per year capacity. And then 2 years later, today, we're expanding that facility to basically triple the size of it. And we have 4 more projects in development. Okay, so that's where we stand. Today, we're basically scaling in line with market demand, right? And then, in 2030, we plan to be doing about 5 million tons of removal per year.
Wow.
So that's our trajectory. We can certainly accelerate that trajectory given our technological readiness, assuming the market demand is there.
That's amazing. Are you based solely in the US? Do you have any plans to expand beyond its borders?
We are based currently in the US, but we do have one project in development in Canada, and we have multiple, I would say, expansion plans throughout the global south. We're not acting on those plans yet, but they're just around the corner in terms of advancing into non-North American countries.
Okay, awesome. Another thing I wanted to pick your brain about is the 45Q tax credit in the US, its current standing. And as you probably know, last week, I believe it was, Congress introduced a bill to repeal the 45Q tax credit, which many are worried may potentially have a devastating effect on carbon management in the US. What are your thoughts on this?
So I would start with, let's go back to the emissions profile we were talking about earlier, particularly in the United States. The only economic sector of the United States where we've made really any material progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions has been the electricity sector. Okay. And the reason that we have done that is really twofold. One is a lot of coal plants have retired and been replaced by a combination of natural gas and renewable, particularly wind and solar plants. Okay. And so we have seen progress, and I'll just kind of, put the natural gas to the side for a moment and just talk about the increase in renewable electricity generation in the United States. The way we did that was through subsidies. Okay. We had the production tax credit. We had the investment tax credit. We incentivized those types of electricity generation through the U.S. tax code. And in doing so, we drove down the cost of electricity generation from renewable facilities dramatically, right? Anybody that works in this space is, familiar with this story, right? But now, solar in particular, and solar and wind, right, are often the cheapest form of electricity out there. They certainly were not 15 years ago. So it's a story of, tax intervention to tax incentives to get the technologies deployed, and then, engineering innovation kicks in and you drive down the cost. So when I think about 45Q, I have the exact same thought. It's the thought of we need government incentives, particularly at the start, to catalyze these technologies to enter the market, with the plans that will not last forever. That is, that will be a catalyst to get the technologies at scale. With scale comes, declining cost, and then we can take the tax credits away into the future. Okay, and so when I think about 45Q, I think, number one, it has a good analog in the production and investment tax credits associated with renewable electricity generation. And that's a real success story in getting an industry to scale and getting the cost down such that now we enjoy lower cost power as a result of it. So I very much hope that 45Q remains intact. And in fact, I think 45Q should be expanded. I think one thing that is not talked about enough is 45Q is on the order of 15 years old, right? It was sometime around, I think, 2008 when 45Q was originally enacted. And it has a fairly narrow lens on suitable technologies. The world has moved a lot since 2008 in terms, certainly no one had ever thought of doing something like what we're doing in 2008. And so I'm hopeful that 45Q is not repealed, that is amended to be more tech neutral and allow for new innovations in the market.
Yeah, let's hope so for sure. Barclay, on a more global scale, I also wanted to get your take on carbon markets, since they're kind of the main feasible business model for carbon removal to exist at all. So what's your take on the newly accepted Article 6.4 mechanism and its implications for carbon markets?
Yeah, I'm happy to see. Well, let me just back up and say I completely agree with you, right? If carbon removal is going to play a role at all in decarbonizing the economy, you have to have a good functioning carbon credit market, right? Because that is the way that you monetize the removals. And when we look across the voluntary carbon markets, there's a lot of problems with them, right? I wrote something not terribly long ago with respect to the supply overhang that exists in the voluntary carbon markets, in that they're just oversupplied, and as a result of being oversupplied, prices remain low. And so I think my overall view here, Violet, is that, we need viable carbon markets. And by viable, I mean ones that people really believe have, high integrity, right? In order for the removal market to take off. The current markets have lots of challenges, particularly around the quality of the credit that are in those markets and just the imbalance between supply and demand. As I mentioned just a second ago, they're oversupplied. So we need to correct that market. And from there, we can have a viable, carbon market on which high quality credits can be exchanged.
There's a lot of speculation that we're actually in for a shortage of, high quality carbon removals and carbon credits. Do you believe that'll be the case?
I do. And the reason is again, going back to kind of the definition of durable or engineered carbon removal, or even for that matter, afforestation, right? If we took the low quality credits away and took a really hard look at the technologies that are in the high, quality category, you see lots of scaling challenges associated with those technologies. On the one hand, you've got just engineering challenges. I mean, I mentioned Graphyte's 15,000 ton facility that was our pilot line that we, commenced operation on in 2024. At the time, that was 15 times the largest direct air capture facility in the United States. That was just our pilot, okay? And so, and as I mentioned, we're already scaling that up. And so I say that to say, there's real challenges around the scale of the durable technologies today. Again, I would somewhat accept graphite from that because of some of the dynamics we've talked about before, our technological readiness, because we're reliant on, or we're utilizing existing technologies just combined in a novel way. And even on the nature-based side, right, if you're in the afforestation reforestation category, those are long lead time projects, right? It takes a long time to plant trees and have them grow to a sufficient size to meaningfully start to remove, carbon. So if we take a real hard look at the technologies that fit within high quality and forecast where we're going to be in, 5 years or so with respect to the scale of those technologies, I think there's a real shortage coming.
Yeah. I know you mentioned your expansion plans earlier, but that aside, what other future plans or upcoming developments do you guys have lined up or that you can already share with us?
With respect to our upcoming plans and announcements, number one is, we are very serious about scaling our business and scaling our business today. I mentioned our expansion in Arkansas. We've got 4 other projects in development across North America. And so we have, quote, pedal to the metal with respect to expansion today. More details will come with respect to those particular projects and locations and off-takers and so on in the near future. But we're getting serious about scaling right now. I think another category that's not related to our scaling plans, but is really related to our quality metrics, if you will, is just yesterday, we worked with B0, and B0 announced effectively our credit rating or their credit quality, compared to others. So we were just really excited to see that we got a AA rating that put us in the top 2% in terms of the quality metrics that B0 uses of all carbon projects that they have reviewed. So I think there's something on the order of about 500 projects that they've reviewed, and we're in the top 2% of those from a quality perspective.
That's fantastic news. Congratulations.
Yeah, the fact that we can land at that quality level and have the relative low cost, relative low energy, and relative scalability, we're just very excited because we think that's the solution that the market needs.
Absolutely. Wonderful. It sounds very exciting. I really can't wait to keep track of you guys' progress. Barclay, thank you so much for your time and for the work you guys are doing at Graphyte. It was a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, Violet.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.